Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 26 and 27. So let's begin. Happy birthday, little dragon. I know it's not much, but I had no idea what you might want, so I got you a new notebook. Plus it's easy to post. I want to hear about all the quirks you write about it in. Missing you still, but have a great birthday. Okeko. Inko sat at the table. Her eyes were closed and she looked at peace, but she was far from it. Her eyes were closed, or else there would be streaming tears. This was the fourth birthday Izuku had not been here for. No one had told her to move on. How did you tell someone to move on from losing their child? But she definitely knew that most people thought she should be, not better but at least more animated. She couldn't though. Inko took medication, but it wasn't enough. She just wanted her Izuku back. The detective had come by the other day to tell her that they still didn't have any leads. She appreciated that he gave her updates, even if they were nothing. It meant that they hadn't forgotten Izuku, the way the rest of the world had. But the lack of leads meant she was still alone. And today, nothing would change that. My little dragon, I know we usually go out to look for hero fights, Hisashi said after the crumbs of lunch were swept away. Izuku nodded, though All for One could see the slight disappointment on his features. They hadn't found a hero fight last year, so in addition to being separated from his friends, Izuku had nothing to write about on his birthday. I thought we'd do it slightly differently today, Hisashi continued. What do you mean, Daddy? Izuku asked. You know heroes make days when they can meet people? Hisashi asked his son. He hadn't yet started on the argument that this was pure consumerism and brand marketing yet. That type of argument required a bit more understanding of the world, and a cynicism that 8-year-old Izuku didn't have. Even so, Izuku's eyes widened at the question. I'm going to meet a hero? He gasped. All for One smiled and nodded. Izuku squealed and ran to give him a hug. Izuku was wavering on the concept that all heroes were good and that it was worthwhile to protect everyone, but he still had an underlying love of the concept of heroes. He was only 8 and conceptually, heroes were attractive. Many things were conceptually attractive, but reality made them fail. Can we go now? Green eyes practically begged even as Izuku asked the question. Hisashi glanced at the time and nodded. Who would you like to meet? He asked as he got the car keys. All Might. Izuku crowed. All for One grimaced theatrically. I don't think Daddy can call the #1 hero, my little dragon, he said. Not to mention the fact that the buffoon would attack on sight. Not that Hisashi feared that. He was more than capable of dealing with the current holder of One for All, but it would present conflicting evidence to his son, and Izuku didn't need that. All Might was currently doing a tour of Aomori, which made Saitama safe enough. Izuku nodded his understanding. He was a reasonable child, with a good grasp of reality, mostly. Today would take another layer off the rose tinting that society gave itself. The children of Izuku's school had done a magnificent job of peeling back the shade, but more had to be done. Hisashi drove them to his office. When you own the building, parking was easy, plus it was the weekend and soon they were on the way up to his area. While he trusted this particular hero, as much as he trusted anyone, there was no need to be complacent. Who is it? Izuku asked. All for One had let him guess on the car ride over, but Izuku hadn't managed to. There were a lot of heroes. It was one of the reasons Hisashi hated them. They were forever multiplying. They made their way to his office, and just outside the door, Hisashi looked down at his son. Are you ready? What? They're here? All for One gave his son an indulgent smile. This is your office. Izuku exclaimed. I thought this was an event, he added. It is an event, Hisashi said. Just for your birthday. At that, Izuku's eyes went impossibly wide, and All for One simply nodded at his son before he placed both hands on Izuku's shoulders, holding him down before he jumped too high. Calm, he murmured. Izuku gulped, and nodded, and Hisashi saw him take several deep breaths. I'm ready, he said eventually. Hisashi smiled, and ran one hand through his son's hair before he swung open the door to his office. He looked inside. The hero was standing to the side of his desk, but from long practice All for One's eyes tracked the corners. There was nothing there, as expected. He ushered Izuku in. Gargoyle. Izuku practically squealed, calm, forgotten. At your service, little man, the hero said, bowing slightly. The hero had gray leathery skin, pointed ears and sharp teeth. He didn't have wings, but Hisashi knew some of his support equipment could fold out to become wings. He had a small set of horns, which were part of his mutation-type quirk. He was generally strong, and the leathery skin wasn't just a visual effect. It was tough and strong, which led to the gargoyle theme. His costume enhanced that. "Dad, I really get to meet Gargoyle?" Izuku questioned Hisashi. "You really do," Gargoyle replied for him. "Your dad told me it's your special day." All for One pushed his son into his office and closed the door behind him. He indicated with a jerk of his head towards one of the side couches and the hero nodded. Izuku understood the motion between the adults and made his way there. "Can I have your autograph?" Izuku gushed the question as Hisashi moved across the room. His office was very large. It was the size of a small apartment, but JBQC was a large company. His desk was up near the windows, and there was an informal meeting area there as well, with 2 couches around a low table. The other side of the room had a traditional Japanese setting with tatami mats. Pillars scattered around the office gave the boundaries of each area but still left enough space for Kurogiri to deposit any guests Hisashi wished to speak with during the day. Hisashi went to his desk, but he kept an eye on his son. Gargoyle knew he couldn't win in a fight, but sometimes people were illogical. He didn't think anything would happen. Gargoyle had been chosen for a reason, but being prepared for almost anything was something he'd learned over time. "Of course you may," Gargoyle replied to Izuku, and for a short time they were silent as the hero signed Izuku's notebook. "Can you tell me about your quirk?" Izuku asked. He seemed slightly uncertain about his question, given that he usually researched hero and villain quirks via watching fights. Having the hero to ask had left him unprepared. All for One already knew about Gargoyle's quirk. It wasn't why the hero was here, but he had given instructions that the hero was to humor Izuku but also drive the conversation. There were certain truths Izuku needed to learn. He thought after the events of the last school year that Izuku was looking for someone to ask. Hisashi listened to them as he pulled out some work. "Can you actually turn into stone?" Izuku asked. Gargoyle laughed softly. "No," he said. "That's just an aesthetic." "What's aesthetic mean?" "It means the look I have," the hero explained. "My quirk is mostly mutation, but it is like a gargoyle because I can stand in place without moving for a very long time, like a gargoyle on a building." And Hisashi knew some people who would have been very interested in having a garden ornament like that if they'd picked up the hero when he was younger. There were a few who were still interested, but All for One had other uses for the hero. His son's education was far more important than their petty desires. From the corner of his eye he saw Izuku's face become thoughtful and he fought the urge to grin. He knew his son. He knew Izuku was working himself up to ask a difficult question. "Are heroes good people?" Izuku rushed the question. All for One saw the expression of surprise on Gargoyle's face. It wasn't a question that a hero got asked. He saw the man think about giving the Hero Association approved answer, but he had warned Gargoyle that lying to his son would have consequences. The truth was what was needed. "Heroes are people, little man." Izuku nodded. "But are heroes good?" he pressed. Hisashi could see Gargoyle's reluctance to answer, but money and fear meant Izuku would get the truth. "Little man, heroes are people," Gargoyle began again. "Some are better than others because it's just a job. But you work to help people." Izuku objected. To him, that meant heroes should be good and he wasn't liking finding out the truth. But childhood was about these lessons. "That's the official word, little man, but do we really help people that much? There are plenty of areas that don't have heroes, where they have to rely on people like your dad." Izuku glanced towards him. Hisashi nodded before his son looked back to Gargoyle. "What do you mean?" he asked. "We're in Saitama Prefecture," Gargoyle told Izuku. "It's pretty close to Tokyo and that means it has one of the lowest populations of heroes in the country." "Why? Most heroes want to work in Tokyo," the hero replied. "Most heroes wanted the recognition of doing so. So, people like your dad step in and?" Izuku prompted. "There are times when heroes hurt people. Only villains." Izuku chirped the Hero Association line. Gargoyle shook his head. "Not only villains. Heroes can hurt people as well, but you don't hear about that." "What do you mean?" Izuku asked curiously. "Sometimes when a hero is trying to catch a villain, a civilian will get hurt." But Hisashi could see his son wasn't sure what to say. That's not right. That's what it is, little man, Gargoyle replied. Heroes protect the way the world is. When you get down to it, we aren't interested in good or bad, we are interested in maintaining the status quo. But you are meant to help people. Gargoyle shook his head. If I was really meant to help people, the Hero Association would pressure more heroes to work in the bad areas. Heroes would campaign against bullying or quirk discrimination. And there'd be a check to make sure those who are becoming heroes want to do it for the right reasons, not just the pay. It took Izuku a few moments to digest that. Why don't you help people? He asked finally. Gargoyle sighed heavily. Because the Hero Association wouldn't like it if I really begin to make waves. They want things to continue on as they are. The hero shrugged. That's one of the reasons, he added. Izuku cocked his head. One of the reasons? Just one, the hero agreed. Little man, your dad is a very powerful man. Even more powerful than the Hero Association, so I work for him. To help people? Gargoyle looked a bit uncomfortable at that. To help people who really need help, the hero answered after thinking about it. So why don't you do that all the time? Hisashi could hear Izuku's confusion, but more pleasingly, he could hear the doubt that was underlying his question. It was doubt in the system, which Izuku had already begun to feel was wrong. Because the Hero Association won't allow it, Gargoyle replied, and this time the answer was far more smooth. They don't want anything to change. Your dad, he wants to make things better. But why won't they allow it? Izuku almost whined the question. They want to maintain the status quo, Gargoyle said quickly. You know what that means, right? The way things are, Izuku nodded. Clever little man, Gargoyle praised. They want to keep things the same. Why? I don't know, little man, but I guess it's because people are afraid of change. Daddy said some heroes were afraid of him, Izuku observed. Because they feared the truth. Hisashi was surprised Izuku remembered that. He'd told Izuku that after the raid that had forced them to move. Gargoyle nodded, though All for One could tell the hero was surprised. The Hero Association would fear your dad, little man, he said. But you'll protect him? The hero let out a breath but smiled at Izuku. Of course. I am a hero, he announced. Despite the fact it was summer. Izuku was tucked snugly into bed. Hisashi sat beside him. Did you have a good day? All for One asked his son. It was the best birthday ever. Izuku replied. Really? He probed. There had been a number of reasons for Izuku to meet Gargoyle, but that didn't mean it would be a good experience. He hadn't wanted to spoil his son's birthday, yet there was very little other opportunity he could see to naturally have Izuku interact with a hero casually. Gargoyle had done well in reinforcing to Izuku that heroes were just people. And therefore they weren't all good. While his son trusted him, and believed him, having outside confirmation of his beliefs simply reinforced them. Izuku nodded emphatically. Really? Hisashi asked again. It really was. I got to meet a hero, Izuku gushed. And Gargoyle said that Daddy was helping people. Daddy is a hero to them. That wasn't quite what he'd been aiming for with the discussion today, but he could work with it. Not everyone thinks I'm a hero, Izuku. They're wrong. It was satisfying to hear those words, but Hisashi knew it was too early to celebrate Izuku's conversion. That was still coming. Thank you, my little dragon, but this was your day, so I hope you had fun. Izuku nodded. So much. Thank you, Daddy. For you, my little dragon, always. Yagi Toshinori looked at the pinboard. It seemed ludicrous that they used such an archaic device to hunt for one of the world's most heinous criminals, but the board allowed them to make connections that other tools didn't. There was software which could double as a pinboard, but looking at these connections on a screen just didn't feel right. There was something about actually being able to move the pins around, to move the strings, that made him feel as if they were making actual connections. This board was stored at his agency, in a tactical room only a select few had access to. Yagi knew there were questions about what they were planning in here, but being the #1 hero meant that everyone knew you took on the biggest and the baddest villains. And you didn't always take them head on. The board was laid out as a timeline. Anyone unfamiliar with All for One would scoff at the fact that the dates began 200 years ago, at the dawn of quirks. There were a couple of fuzzy images from various archives, and then the timeline moved on. After all but one of the people alive then was dead now. At seemingly random intervals there were numbers pinned on the board in Roman numerals. I was at the beginning. 2 was not that long after I, but 3 was distant from 2. IV and V followed in quick succession before there was again a gap. VI, 7 and VIII were on there as well. There was no IX. If you studied the board long enough, you would deduce that the numbers represented major events, but those familiar with history would also know that there were no major events in some of the years the numbers corresponded to. The numbers were for those who were intimately familiar with the case. It said a lot that there were probably only 5 people in the world who knew exactly what they meant. And one of those people was the villain they were hunting. The closer the timeline got to the present, the more pins and links there were. There were headshots of various people, though some were crossed out. They were known to be dead. A few of the links went to lists, and Yagi hated looking at those lists. They were lists of the dead or quirkless. There were a couple of crossed-out headshots that were attached to a period of time. They were the people whose identities All for One had stolen. While the villain was more than capable of manufacturing a complete persona from scratch, it was easier to take over someone else's life. The paperwork was more authentic and thus harder to track. And when you were a villain like All for One, making sure the original person didn't claim their identity back wasn't even a chore. Yagi stared at one of the few clear shots they had of the man. It was the shot Inko Midoriya had supplied. It was good enough to use facial recognition on, and Sir Nighteye had, but there was a problem with that. The databases were limited to those who had a criminal record already. All for One was nothing, if not careful. He never took over the identity of anyone with a criminal history. He took their quirks, but he never took their identities. They had traced Hisashi Seiki, but all that had given them was gravestones. Dead parents, no siblings, no cousins and no leads. Hisashi hadn't spoken to his more distant relatives for years before Inko met him, and he certainly hadn't spoken to them since. The last few years were traced out on the board, and they were marked with significantly less pins and connections. He's gone to ground, Yagi said. We don't know that, Mirai replied. Toshinori understood the reasons. If All for One had gone to ground, it wasn't because of anything they had done, which meant it was part of a plan, and that didn't sit right with either of them. The thought that there was anyone or anything else out there who could threaten All for One was laughable. There were powerful organizations out there and they were still active, but none of them would threaten All for One. Not if they wanted to still exist. He was behind most of them anyway. Not that their members realized it. Why would he have gone to ground? Mirai asked. Yagi gestured to the photo. It was folded so that Inko and her son couldn't be seen, but they both knew what the whole image contained. He's never raised children before, Mirai countered, gesturing to the timeline. Throughout his history, All for One had used children, on occasion, but he had never raised them. If he was now, then there was no reason. If Izuku had a quirk that was valuable, then he would have taken it. As far as they knew, he was immortal and thus didn't need an heir. And he had plenty of underlings who were falling over themselves to do his bidding. He didn't need a son. Yagi took a deep breath. So why did he take his son? He asked. His sidekick looked just as frustrated as he was for a moment. Experimentation. Mirai replied immediately. Yagi shook his head. He's run experiments before, but he's never experimented upon himself, he said. They weren't completely sure of that, of course, but All for One was not the type of man to put himself at risk. The only reason he would need his own flesh and blood for experimentation would be shit. Mirai paled as he said the word. It had been bad enough when Naomasa had suggested that All for One had arranged to have a child for the chance of duplicating his own quirk. That was still possible, but it didn't explain why he hadn't simply taken it and left Izuku with Inko. If that had happened, it would fit with everything they knew. What would he be trying to find? Yagi mused aloud. A new copy of All for One? No, Mirai said shortly. One for all, he announced. How? We know he wants One for all back, Mirai began explaining after taking a deep breath. You won't give it to him, but you will pass it on at some stage, so he could be grooming his son to be a candidate. That would be a long shot, Yagi said. When he chose a successor, he or she would be carefully considered. As much as it disturbed him to think about it, all their connections would be known. Perhaps, but it is something is never tried before. The alternative is that he has some plan to capture you, and then force you to give up One for all. That was a possibility. They thought it had happened to the fourth holder. At this end of history, they couldn't be sure and no one was going to ask the man who knew. Except it appeared the fourth holder had already passed on One for All. You'll just have to find me before that happens, Yagi murmured. What could you say to the prospect of torture? One for All could not be forcibly taken, it had to be willingly given, but no one wanted to test if that also included given after torture. Mirai gave him a hard look but said nothing. All right, Toshinori sighed. Let's say it's not the boy, he began. Is not as active as he was, which means he's planning something, but what? They didn't even have anything like a cryptic hint, and as the silence stretched the two of them looked at the board. They'd been at a stalemate with tracking down All for One for months now. Look into the future, Yagi announced, looking at his sidekick. What? Mirai almost choked. Look into my future, he clarified. We need something. He added the justification. Mirai would usually have told him no and walked away, and truthfully Yagi knew his sidekick didn't like using his quirk like that. There were too many things that could be misinterpreted. Right at the moment, even a bad hint would be something, Toshinori said tiredly. Mirai sighed, and pushed up his glasses. The gold of the frame flashed in the light. In a week, he counted. If Takeo hasn't come up with anything in a week, I'll do it then. Yagi nodded. That was better than he expected. He looked at the image again. One way or another, he was going to find All for One, and end this once and for all. Dear Uraraka. I wish you could have come to my birthday this year. I got to meet Gargoyle. Yes, the hero Gargoyle. If you look him up you'll see he's in Saitama, which is where we've moved to. It was so cool. His quirk is fantastic and has so many aspects. Did you know he can just stand watch, all day, not moving? If a normal person tried that, they'd pass out. Eventually. It was so great. Thank you for your card and for the notebook. I wrote about Gargoyle in it. I'm going to make your notebook for heroes that I meet. So I've also moved Saber Wind's entry in there. Did I tell you about her? Dad took me to watch one of her fights when I was 5. I got her autograph as well. Then she disappeared. I hope she's okay. So that notebook may not fill up that quickly because it will be for heroes that I meet, not just those I see, but that makes it special. Say hello to Minato for me, and Kazuo. I miss you too. But think of it this way. I'll have more friends I can introduce you to when we meet again. Azuku. Kyudai Garaki didn't shiver as All for One walked around the liquid-filled tube. He sat with Johnny and waited. Hisashi examined the creature that was floating in the tube with a critical eye. It had black skin and was unconscious. Its eyes were exposed, as was its brain. Large corded muscles covered it. What quirks does this one have? Hisashi asked. Water gun, smokescreen and spike, Dr. Garaki answered immediately. Marking the larger prototype had proven more difficult than expected. Johnny had been relatively simple to create, but that had been over 2 years ago. The larger prototype was expected to take longer on account of the size difference, but not this long. I gather it's as robust as the one in your lap? Yes. But? Hisashi pressed. It will not operate independently, Kyudai told All for One. It can fight and it is tough, but it must be ordered to do almost everything. Fetch the plate is something it understands, but fight is beyond it. Fight is beyond it? Hisashi drawled. That was his dangerous tone. Fetch was simple. Fight, while still only a single word, was much more involved. It required thinking. I believe it has to do with the base material, Garaki said quickly. This one broke with the second quirk. Physically, it far surpasses human ability, he continued, subtly reminding All for One that he had wanted to see the base physical enhancements in this one. It was so much easier, in a way, to work with corpses, and All for One knew that. But for true physical enhancement and multiple quirks, working with a live base seemed to be the most reliable way. When that base was suitable. Do you have any way of determining samples who won't break? Unfortunately not, he had to admit. It wasn't like he got to test his theories exhaustively, but he had several ideas. I believe the younger generation may be more suitable though, as their quirk factor is enhanced. You also told me that children are not large enough, Hisashi reminded him. That was true. A teenager would be the best compromise, Garaki said. But if we can find someone who is about 20, and 7th generation, then I believe they may be able to better adapt. Hisashi took a deep breath and released it. Those used in experiments were those society forgot. They got a place to sleep and regular meals, and that was a good deal for them. Let's test that. Asked Nasuto for some recommendations. Kyudai nodded. I do have some in mind, he murmured. Oh? All for One's tone told him to continue. Foreign isn't going to be an issue? Of course not, Hisashi scoffed. He'd long ago learned that borders were simply there for the masses. There was no fundamental difference between people. They might eat different things, they might claim to value different things, but in the end, they all bleed red. That was enough similarity for him. Then China's quirk registry has some interesting possibilities, Garaki informed All for One. How do you know? Kyudai grinned. They finally got their centralized database up and running. Understanding passed across Hisashi's expression. Is there anything else of interest in the database? I believe you might be interested in this one, Garaki said, spinning his chair and tapping at the keyboard to bring up a display. Hisashi left the tube and walked forward to look at the screen. Hiryu Ren, quirk scale, he read before he read the description of what it did. Oh, I do like that, he agreed. He'd loved Ruko Tatsuma's quirk ever since he'd seen it at UA's sports festival, but being a hero student of UA, she was a little too public for him to take the quirk from. That usually wouldn't have bothered him, but he didn't need that buffoon All Might finding him quite yet. This child was younger, and while the transformation wasn't as complete, it was useful. Are there any others? Some, Garaki smiled. The Chinese registry makes it so much easier to find quirks. I don't suppose you could influence anyone to have Japan adopt it? Hisashi gave the doctor a look. He was powerful, but not that powerful. Japan wouldn't take something they saw as a copy of a Chinese system. Who else has good registries? He asked instead. Nicaragua, Garaki replied immediately. Surprisingly, they did have a great register for quirks. Togo. Again, they maintained good records. No one more recognized? Hisashi asked. Countries might not bother him, but they were important to others. Luxembourg does, but given their population that is not surprising. Most other countries with similar populations to Japan have the same issues with maintaining quirk registries. Pity, All for One muttered, still looking at the screen. I think a business trip is in order, he announced. Kyudai chuckled. I'll give you a shopping list, he murmured. It would take at least a few days to organize and come up with plausible reasons for Hisashi to need to visit China, but the list he provided was the key. It would tell All for One where he needed to visit and who he needed to meet. Get to work on another prototype. I want it more functional this time, All for One instructed. And this one? Is it physically unenhanced? Hisashi asked for confirmation. As requested, there are no quirk-based physical enhancements, Kyudai confirmed. Then test to destruction. Find out its real limits, Hisashi instructed. I have plans for these things. Garaki nodded as All for One left. Then he looked at the prototype. With its deficiencies, he wasn't surprised by the instruction, but sometimes it would be nice if Hisashi could remember that he was conducting experimental science. Things did not always go to plan. Still, he had learned a thing or two over the years, and knowing how to distract the ancient villain was one of them. Quirk registries were so useful at times. End chapters 26 and 27, The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.